A jar of foreign coins sits on a shelf in an old kitchen, kept there since a bank 3 towns over failed and a grandmother decided that money under glass was the only kind she trusted again. Nobody in that house remembers the failed bank's name, but everyone can recite the lesson it taught, word for word down 3 generations. Most of what people believe about money did not arrive as an argument they weighed and accepted. It arrived as an inheritance, passed down the way a family passes down a recipe or a grudge, unexamined because it always seemed too obvious to examine. This list holds 50 of those inherited beliefs up to the light. Some are outright wrong, born from a misquoted line of scripture or a quote nobody ever actually said. Some are half true, worn smooth by centuries of retelling until the sharp, strange original fact underneath has gone soft and comfortable. A few were once perfectly reasonable, and simply stopped being true when the world around them changed. None of what follows is a suggestion for what to do with your own money. This is a channel about what people have done with theirs, across 5,000 years of ledgers, coin hoards, bank panics, and quiet family catastrophes, and about the strange, stubborn stories humans keep telling themselves about wealth long after the facts have moved on without them. One of these myths, once you see how it actually started, quietly decides how an entire family talks about money for 100 years. Settle in. There is a great deal of ground to cover, and none of it moves quickly. For generations, a single phrase has circulated as settled scripture. Money is the root of all evil, quoted with total confidence at kitchen tables, in sermons and on needlework hung above mantelpieces. The actual verse, from a letter traditionally attributed to Paul and addressed to Timothy, says something narrower and more interesting. It names not money, but the love of money, as a root of all kinds of evil, and the difference between those 2 sentences is the whole point of the passage. The distinction mattered to the people who first wrote and copied it. Money, in the world of first-century Rome, was understood as a tool, morally neutral, capable of funding a temple roof or a soldier's bribe with equal ease. What worried the letter's author was not the coin itself, but the appetite that could form around it, an attachment strong enough to reorder a person's loyalties and choices. Ancient moral writing was full of this same worry, stated, in other words. Stoic philosophers wrote about the anxious grip of desire for possessions long before this letter was composed, and later Christian commentators spent centuries drawing exactly this line between the object and the craving. The misquote likely survives because it is simpler to say and easier to remember. Dropping 2 words turns a specific psychological warning into a sweeping condemnation, and sweeping condemnations travel further than nuance ever does. It has been repeated in pulpits, on posters, and in arguments about inheritance for so long that the shorter, wrong version now feels more authoritative than the verse it replaced, even to people who have read the original passage. Historians of religious language see this kind of drift constantly. A text survives centuries intact, and then a popular retelling quietly edits it in one generation, and the edit outlives the source. What makes the original phrasing worth restoring is not correctness for its own sake. It changes who the warning is actually aimed at. A blanket condemnation of money accuses everyone who has ever earned a wage. A warning about the love of money accuses no one who is not already looking too hard at what they have. The coin was never the problem the letter was written to solve. Search for the source of the world's most quoted line about money, and you find nothing. The line credits Albert Einstein with calling compound interest the 8th wonder of the world, sometimes adding that whoever understands it earns, and whoever does not pays. No lecture, letter, notebook, or interview from Einstein's own lifetime contains it. The quote appears to surface decades after his death, in popular finance writing, with no citation ever produced by anyone who has looked. This kind of misattribution has a familiar shape. A borrowed authority, especially a famous scientist's name, makes an ordinary observation sound like discovered truth rather than arithmetic. Einstein's actual field, theoretical physics, has nothing to do with interest rates, which makes the pairing almost certainly a later invention rather than a genuine remark that simply went undocumented. Historians who study quote attribution call this a floating quotation, a phrase detached from any real originator, and then anchored to whichever famous name lends it the most weight. The idea underneath the fake quote is old and does not need Einstein's help to be interesting. Compound interest describes what happens when returns are calculated not just on an original sum, but also on whatever that sum has already earned, so that growth accelerates rather than staying flat. Merchants in medieval Italy understood this well enough to build banking fortunes on it. Islamic and Christian scholars debated its ethics for centuries specifically, because they understood how powerful the mechanism was. None of that history needed a 20th century physicist to validate it, and the mechanism was already fully described in mathematics texts long before any physicist alive today was born. The persistence of the fake quote says more about how people relate to financial ideas than it says about Einstein. A concept explained by a genius feels like a secret finally revealed. The same concept explained as ordinary compounding arithmetic feels like homework. Neither feeling changes what the mathematics actually does. Nobody has ever found the letter where Einstein supposedly wrote it, because it does not exist. A number gets repeated so often it stops sounding like a claim and starts sounding like weather. Most lottery winners go bankrupt within a few years. It shows up in news segments, in casual conversation, in warnings parents give their children about sudden money. The number's actual origin is far shakier than its confidence suggests, tracing back to a statement from a financial education non-profit that the organization itself later retracted after failing to produce solid data behind it. What documented cases do exist tell a messier, more varied story than a single tidy statistic. Some winners, thrust into sudden wealth with no preparation for the attention, requests, and decisions that follow, have indeed lost fortunes within a handful of years, and a few of those stories are well recorded and genuinely striking. Other winners, often quieter and less covered by the press, precisely because nothing dramatic happened to them, simply paid off debts, kept working, and lived unremarkably. Journalists naturally gravitate toward the dramatic collapses, which skews public perception of how common collapse actually is, since a happy, boring outcome rarely makes the news at all. Psychologists who study sudden wealth describe a real and specific set of pressures that have nothing to do with financial literacy. A winner is suddenly visible to distant relative, former acquaintances, and strangers who feel entitled to a share, and the social pressure to give, lend, and spend arrives faster than most people can build the habits or boundaries to manage it. That pressure is documented and worth taking seriously. What is not well documented is a specific, reliable bankruptcy rate attached to it. The gap between the popular statistic and the actual, more complicated record is itself worth noticing, because it shows how easily a retracted claim can outlive its retraction once it has been repeated enough times by people who never checked where it came from. The number everyone quotes was withdrawn by the very people who first published it. In the winter of 1637, in taverns across the Dutch Republic, men traded contracts for flowers that would not bloom for months, sometimes for sums that historians can only compare to the price of a canal house. The image has become one of the most famous cautionary tales in financial history, and like most famous cautionary tales, it has been simplified past the point of accuracy in the retelling. The documented extreme cases are real. A single bulb of the variety known as Esiemper Augustus, prized for its striped red and white petals caused by a virus nobody at the time understood, did trade at prices that could rival a substantial Amsterdam property. Those specific rare bulbs genuinely commanded extraordinary sums among a narrow circle of collectors and speculators. What the popular version of the story leaves out is scale. The overwhelming majority of tulip bulbs traded during this period were ordinary flowers bought and sold at ordinary, unremarkable prices, never approaching anything like a house. Historian Anne Goldgar's research into contemporary records complicated the story further, finding far fewer documented cases of catastrophic personal ruin than the popular legend suggests. The mania was real. Prices for certain varieties did rise and then collapse sharply within weeks in early 1637, and it did produce genuine financial stress for some participants. But the widespread image of an entire nation gripped by madness, with fortunes and families destroyed on every street, appears to be a later exaggeration, amplified by moralizing writers in the following century, who used the episode as a parable about greed rather than a precise financial history. None of this makes the actual event less interesting. A market briefly agreeing that a flower could rival real estate, and then just as quickly deciding it could not, says something durable about how quickly collective certainty can form and dissolve around an object whose only real value was always aesthetic. The bulbs went back to being flowers. Andrew Carnegie told his own story often, and told it well, a poor Scottish immigrant boy who rose through nothing but effort and thrift to build one of the largest steel fortunes in American history. The story became a template for an entire national mythology about wealth earned purely through individual will, repeated in school books and self-improvement writing for over a century. The documented details of Carnegie's early career complicate the pure version of that story without erasing his genuine drive. His first significant job as a telegraph operator put him in daily contact with railroad executives who noticed his sharp mind and gave him access to information and introductions well beyond what an ordinary young clerk could expect. A railroad superintendent named Thomas Scott personally mentored him and helped arrange his earliest investments, including a loan that let him buy shares in a sleeping car company at a price ordinary workers of the era could never have raised on their own. None of this erases Carnegie's intelligence or effort. It simply shows that effort operated inside a structure of access that his own retelling tended to minimize. This pattern repeats across many celebrated self-made fortunes once historians look closely at the documented record rather than the polished retrospective account. A useful early connection, a family safety net that absorbed an early failure without destroying the person attempting it. A piece of information reaching one person before it reached everyone else. Sociologists' wealth formation call this the difference between the story a fortune tells about itself after the fact and the actual conditions that made the fortune possible in the first place. The story is simpler and more flattering. The conditions are messier and more instructive. None of this is an argument that effort does not matter. It plainly does, and Carnegie's did. It is only an argument that effort rarely operates entirely alone, however completely a triumphant retelling omits everything standing beside it. The story a fortune tells about itself is never the whole ledger. In 2010, psychologist Daniel K.H. Munn and economist Angus Deaton published a widely cited finding suggesting emotional well-being rises with income only up to a point, often summarized in the press as a plateau near $75,000 a year, beyond which more money brought no additional day-to-day happiness. The finding fit neatly into an old moral intuition that money matters only up to comfort and stops mattering after, and it was repeated constantly for over a decade as settled science. In 2021, researcher Matthew Killingsworth published a large-scale study using a different measurement method, tracking people's reported feelings in real time across a broad income range, and found no such plateau. Happiness, in his data, continued rising with income for most people well past the earlier proposed ceiling. The two findings appeared to contradict each other directly, until Killingsworth and K.H.N. Munn, working together with researcher Barbara Mel-Ers in 2023, reanalyzed both datasets and found the original plateau was mostly driven by a specific unhappy minority within the sample, whose distress did not ease with additional income, while happiness kept climbing for the broader majority. The reconciled picture is less quotable than either original headline, which may explain why the outdated plateau version still circulates far more widely than the correction. It also says something about how a comforting moral lesson can outcompete a more accurate but more complicated one, especially when the comforting version happens to align with an older piece of folk wisdom that money loses its power once basic needs are met. The corrected research does not claim money purchases happiness in any simple sense. It simply removes a tidy ceiling that popular retellings had assumed was there. The plateau everyone remembers turned out to be a shadow cast by only some of the people studied. Hetty Green died in 1916, controlling a fortune historians estimate at well over $100 million, making her by some measures the wealthiest woman in the United States, and she spent much of her life doing everything possible to avoid appearing wealthy at all. Newspapers of the era called her the Witch of Wall Street, a nickname earned through documented habits that included wearing the same worn black dress for years and reportedly refusing adequate medical treatment for her own son's injured leg to save on doctors' fees, a decision that eventually cost him the limb. Green's investment instincts were, by any measure, sound. She built her fortune through careful, methodical lending and real estate dealing, often extending loans to cash-strapped businesses and even city governments during financial panics, when few others would, at rates that reflected the risk she was taking on. Her caution during boom periods and her willingness to lend during downturns made her generally skilled at reading financial cycles most of her contemporaries misread. What makes her case interesting to psychologists studying hoarding behavior is the gap between her financial competence and her personal deprivation. Hoarding, as clinicians describe it, is rarely about simple greed or a desire for more. It is more often anxiety wearing the appearance of thrift, a fear of loss so persistent that even abundant, secure wealth cannot quiet it. Green had, by any objective measure, more security than almost anyone alive in her era, and by all documented accounts lived as though catastrophe were always one expense away. Her story sits uncomfortably against the popular image of misers as simply careful people who understand money better than everyone else. Green understood money exceptionally well. Understanding it did not appear to bring her any peace. She died one of the richest women in the country, and was buried by her own careful instruction without excess. On a Sunday evening in August 1971, President Richard Nixon announced on national television that the United States would no longer convert dollars held by foreign governments into gold at a fixed rate, ending an arrangement that had underpinned international finance since the end of the Second World War. The announcement is often remembered as the moment money stopped being real and became something more abstract, a phrase that misunderstands what gold backing actually did. Under the gold standard in its various historical forms, a currency's value was tied to a promise that a unit of it could be exchanged for a fixed quantity of gold held somewhere in a vault. This did not make the money itself gold, and it did not make the system immune to crisis. Countries on strict gold standards during the 19th and early 20th centuries still suffered severe banking panics, deflationary spirals, and currency crises because the fixed exchange rate to gold constrained how governments could respond to those crises, sometimes making downturns worse rather than better. Economic historians studying the interwar period have argued the rigid gold standard actively deepened the Great Depression in several countries by preventing central banks from expanding the money supply when it was most needed. What backed money in every era, including the gold standard era, was never really the metal itself. It was the collective willingness of people holding the currency to trust that others would accept it in exchange for goods and labor. Gold offered a psychologically reassuring anchor for that trust, a tangible object people could point to, but the actual mechanism doing the work was always social agreement rather than metallurgy. Money did not become fictional the day the gold window closed. It had always depended on the same quiet, collective agreement it depends on now. The vault emptied out, and the currency kept being spent the next morning exactly as it had the day before. Through the 16th century, ships loaded with silver mined at Potosi, high in the mountains of what is now Bolivia, crossed the Atlantic bound for the Spanish crown in numbers that made Spain the wealthiest state in Europe on paper. The Spanish monarchy, holding a legal claim to a fifth of everything the mines produced, should by any simple counting have been the most financially secure government on the continent. Instead, the Spanish crown defaulted on its debts at least 4 separate times during this period of supposed unprecedented wealth, in 1557, 1560, 1575 and 1596, each default rattling the banking houses across Europe that had extended it credit against future silver shipments. The mechanism behind this apparent contradiction is now well understood by economic historians. The crown borrowed heavily against silver that had not yet arrived, financing wars across multiple fronts simultaneously, and the flow of new silver, however enormous, never kept pace with military spending that grew even faster. Meanwhile, the sheer volume of silver flooding into Europe drove a sustained rise in prices across the continent, a phenomenon historians call the price revolution, which eroded the real purchasing power of that silver even as more of it kept arriving. Genoese and German banking families, who had lent heavily to the Spanish crown, expecting the silver fleets to make repayment straightforward, learned repeatedly that a resource windfall and financial stability are not the same thing. Wealth flowing in did not translate automatically into a treasury that could meet its obligations, because the spending attached to that wealth expanded to match and then exceed it. Potter's silver made Spain look wealthier than almost any state in its history. It did not make Spain's finances any more secure. The mountain kept giving up silver long after the crown had stopped being able to pay its debts with it. An old proverb, found in some form across several cultures, holds that family fortunes tend to collapse within 3 generations, moving from shirtsleeves to shirtsleeves, as the saying goes in its American form. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who died in 1877, controlling a fortune historians estimate at roughly the equivalent of well over $100 million in the money of his day. One of the largest personal fortunes in American history to that point, offers one of the proverb's most thoroughly documented illustrations. Vanderbilt built his wealth through steamships and then railroads, personally overseeing an aggressive hands-on business style that expanded his holdings for decades. His will left the overwhelming majority of the fortune to his son William, who by most documented accounts managed and even grew it further during his own lifetime, disproving the idea that the second generation always squanders what the first built. The collapse, when it came, arrived mostly in the third and fourth generations, as the fortune divided among an increasing number of descendants, many of whom spent lavishly on mansions, entertaining and social ambition, rather than reinvesting or consolidating the underlying businesses. A 1973 Vanderbilt family reunion, well documented by journalists at the time, reportedly could not locate a single millionaire among the descendants present, less than a century after the family had counted among the wealthiest in the nation. Economists and sociologists who study family wealth attribute this pattern less to any single generation's specific failing than to simple arithmetic and diverging incentive. A fortune built by one person's sustained focus divides, generation after generation, among an expanding number of heirs, each managing their share with less of the founder's original urgency and often none of the founder's original skill. The Vanderbilts did not lose their fortune all at once. It simply thinned generation by generation until there was too little left in any single pair of hands to call a fortune at all. A familiar story taught for generations in introductory economics courses describes early human economies moving through a fixed sequence. First, isolated barter between neighbours trading goods directly. Then, eventually, as barter's inefficiencies became too clumsy to bear, the invention of money to smooth the exchange. The story is tidy, logical, and largely unsupported by the archaeological and historical record anthropologists have actually recovered. What the record shows instead, in early Mesopotamian temple economies and in numerous documented traditional societies, studied by anthropologists in more recent centuries, is that communities relied heavily on credit, obligation, and communal record-keeping long before anything resembling barter between strangers became common. Temple administrators in ancient Sumer kept detailed clay tablet records of who owed what to whom in grain, livestock, or labour, settling accounts periodically rather than trading item for item in the moment. Within small, tightly connected communities, people simply remembered what they owed each other, or trusted a shared record keeper to remember for them, without needing to exchange anything on the spot at all. Direct barter between strangers with no ongoing relationship, the scenario the textbook story depends on, does appear in the historical record, but typically at the edges of established economies, between groups without a shared system of trust or credit to fall back on, rather than as a universal starting stage every society passed through before inventing money. Anthropologists studying documented traditional economies have found remarkably few examples of a pure barter economy functioning as its own stable primary system over any sustained period. The barter story persists mostly because it is intuitive and easy to teach, a clean mechanical explanation for something that was, in practice, social and relational from the very beginning. Money did not rescue humanity from an age of clumsy trading. It formalized a kind of trust that communities had already been keeping track of for a very long time. The earliest coins that archaeologists have recovered and dated with confidence come from the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, minted sometime in the 7th century before the Common Era under rulers, including the famously wealthy King Croesus. The popular assumption is that coinage arose to make marketplace trade easier, replacing clumsier earlier systems of exchange with a convenient, standardized token. The documented context of Lydian coinage suggests a more specific origin. Early Lydian coins were struck from electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, and stamped with official seals guaranteeing a consistent weight and purity that merchants and rulers alike could trust without needing to test each piece by hand. Historians studying the period note that the earliest and most consistent use of these standardized coins appears to have been paying soldiers, a use case where a ruler needed to distribute a large portable, verifiable form of value to many people quickly and reliably, in amounts too large and too frequent for barter or informal credit to handle smoothly. Marketplace trade certainly adopted coinage quickly once it existed, and coins spread across the Mediterranean world within a couple of centuries, partly because merchants found them genuinely convenient. But the initial administrative pressure that produced the innovation appears to have come from the state's own logistical needs rather than from merchants demanding a better tool. A king needed to pay an army, verify tribute, and standardize taxation across a growing territory, and a stamped weighed piece of metal solved several of those problems at once. Croesus became proverbial for wealth in the ancient world, his name surviving into modern English in phrases about being rich as Croesus, in part because his kingdom's coinage made his riches unusually visible and countable in a way that stored grain or unminted metal never had been. The coin in a merchant's palm began its life as a soldier's pay. For long stretches of history, lending money at interest was not simply frowned upon in many major traditions, it was formally banned or tightly restricted by religious and civil law. Medieval Christian church doctrine treated usury, broadly meaning any interest charged on a loan, as a sin, citing scripture and church councils that condemned profiting from another person's need. Islamic law developed an equally firm prohibition against riba, a category encompassing interest-based lending that remains formally observed in Islamic finance today. Jewish law, drawing on passages in Deuteronomy, restricted interest charged between fellow members of the community while permitting it in transactions with outsiders, a distinction that shaped centuries of medieval European lending patterns. The practical effects of these prohibitions rippled through medieval economic life in specific, documented ways. Because canon law barred Christians from lending at interest to other Christians, money lending in much of medieval Europe fell disproportionately to Jewish communities, who operated under different religious restrictions, an arrangement that provided a needed financial service while also fueling centuries of resentment and periodic violent persecution against Jewish lenders, specifically because of the role they had been pushed into. Christian merchants and bankers, meanwhile, developed elaborate workarounds, structuring loans as investment partnerships or currency exchange arrangements that produced effectively the same return as interest without technically naming it as such, a practice church authorities periodically tried and largely failed to suppress. By the time the Protestant Reformation reshaped religious attitudes toward commerce in the 16th century, formal opposition to interest had softened considerably in much of Europe, though Islamic prohibitions on riba have persisted in various forms into the present, shaping an entire modern industry of interest-free financial structuring. None of these traditions treated lending at interest as a simple, neutral fact of commerce, the way it is often assumed to have always been. Each wrestled, for centuries, with whether profiting from another person's borrowed need was closer to trade or closer to exploitation. The workaround always survived longer than the prohibition it was built to dodge. The Medici Bank, founded in Florence in 1397, is often described simply as a banking house, an early and unusually successful predecessor to modern financial institutions. That description, while accurate as far as it goes, badly understates what the bank's profits actually purchased for the family that controlled it. Under Cesare Medici in the early 15th century, and later under his grandson Lorenzo, the family used its banking fortune to fund an extraordinary web of political and religious influence across Florence and beyond. The bank operated branches in major European cities and served, among its documented clients, the papacy itself, managing significant portions of church finances, a relationship that gave the Medici family unusual insight into and leverage over Vatican affairs. That leverage eventually helped place family members directly into positions of religious authority, and the Medici produced multiple popes across succeeding generations, most notably Leo X and later Clement VII, elevations that owed at least as much to accumulated financial influence as to any independent religious standing. Within Florence itself, the Medici used banking profits to fund public works, church construction, and lavish patronage of artists including Michelangelo and Botticelli, building a reputation for civic generosity that translated directly into political loyalty and influence among the city's population. Cosimo effectively controlled Florentine politics for decades without ever holding formal supreme office, ruling through financial leverage over other powerful families and strategic placement of allies in official positions, a form of influence historians of the period describe as more effective and more durable than outright rule by decree. The bank's ledgers, where they survive, show ordinary deposits, loans, and currency exchanges, the mundane daily business of any financial house. What those ordinary transactions ultimately financed was a family dynasty that shaped Florentine politics, the Catholic Church, and the course of the Italian Renaissance itself. A loan repaid on schedule in Medici hands could quietly rearrange who held power in an entire city. Rulers in ancient Mesopotamia periodically issued what modern historians call clean slate decrees, formal proclamations cancelling outstanding debts across their kingdoms, sometimes specifically targeting agricultural loans that had accumulated during years of poor harvests. The Babylonian king Hammurabi, best remembered today for his famous law code, is documented issuing at least one such general debt cancellation during his reign, and similar decrees appear in the records of earlier Sumerian rulers as well. These were not isolated acts of royal generosity, but appear to have functioned as a recurring pressure valve within a well-understood problem. Small farmers, borrowing seed grain or animals against a future harvest, could fall into debt bondage when a harvest failed, sometimes to the point of having to sell their own labour, or even family members, into servitude to satisfy what they owed. Left unaddressed across enough failed harvests, this pattern could concentrate an alarming share of a kingdom's productive land and labour into the hands of a small class of creditors, destabilising the tax base and military manpower a ruler depended on. A periodic clean slate, cancelling personal debts, while typically leaving commercial trade debts between merchants untouched, functioned as a documented tool for resetting that imbalance before it became unmanageable for the state itself. This history sits uneasily against a modern instinct to treat all debt as simply a moral or personal failing, a signal of poor discipline rather than a structural feature of how agricultural economies have always distributed risk between good years and bad ones. Ancient rulers, dealing directly with the political consequences of untreated debt spirals, appear to have understood debt as a recurring social pressure requiring periodic, deliberate release rather than as a simple binary of virtue and vice attached to individual borrowers. The tablets recording these cancellations still exist, carefully inscribed, in more than one Mesopotamian royal archive. A kingdom's ledgers, it turns out, have been wiped clean on purpose since before written history had much else worth writing down. A quiet assumption runs underneath a great deal of popular thinking about poverty, that people with little money got there and stay there, mainly through poor decisions, a lack of planning, or insufficient power compared to people with more. Behavioural researchers studying the psychology of scarcity have documented something considerably more complicated and more humane, running in the opposite causal direction than the assumption suggests. Financial scarcity, researchers have found, imposes a measurable cognitive burden of its own, independent of any pre-existing difference in a person's judgment or discipline. When someone is constantly calculating whether a bill can be covered, whether a car repair means missing a meal, or whether an emergency expense will cascade into a larger crisis, that ongoing calculation consumes a documented share of the same limited mental attention people use for every other decision in their lives, from parenting to work performance to long-term planning. Researchers studying this effect have compared it to the cognitive drain of chronic sleep deprivation, a persistent tax on attention that has nothing to do with a person's underlying intelligence or character, and everything to do with the specific, narrowing pressure of not having enough. This reframes a familiar and often unkind observation that people under financial strain sometimes make short-term decisions that appear to worsen their situation as a predictable consequence of scarcity's cognitive load, rather than as evidence of some prior personal failing that caused the scarcity in the first place. The causal arrow, in the documented research, runs at least as strongly from scarcity toward narrowed decision-making as it does the other way around, a finding with real implications for how policy and public assistance programs are designed, since programs assuming poor judgment causes poverty tend to produce very different designs than programs recognizing scarcity itself narrows judgment. None of this claims that individual choices never matter, only that a persistent shortage of resources changes how any mind, regardless of its underlying capability, is able to make choices at all. The narrowing happens to the mind first, and the consequences people notice arrive only afterward. In Britain in 1720, shares of the South Sea Company, a firm holding a government-granted monopoly on trade with Spanish America, rose to nearly 10 times their value within a single year before collapsing catastrophically, ruining investors across British society, including, famously, Isaac Newton himself, who lost a substantial sum in the crash despite his mathematical genius. The episode is often told as an isolated British financial catastrophe, a single company's fraudulent promises meeting a gullible public. Almost simultaneously, across the English Channel in France, an eerily similar collapse was unfolding around the Mississippi Company, a trading enterprise controlling French territorial claims in North America, whose shares Scottish financier John Law had engineered into a speculative frenzy backed by an ambitious and ultimately disastrous scheme to replace French coinage with paper currency tied to the company's fortunes. The Mississippi bubble collapsed within months of the South Sea Company's crash, for remarkably similar underlying reasons, driven by public enthusiasm for a speculative venture whose actual overseas trading prospects bore little resemblance to the soaring value of its shares. Economic historians studying both episodes together note the two nations were experiencing a shared continental moment, a period when paper financial instruments, joint stock companies, and speculative trading culture were still novel enough that neither the investing public nor the governing authorities had developed reliable tools for evaluating a company's actual worth versus the public excitement surrounding its shares. Both schemes also involved governments deeply entangled in the company's fortunes, using them to manage staggering war debts, which meant political authorities had strong incentives to encourage rather than restrain the speculative enthusiasm while it lasted. Treating the South Sea bubble as a uniquely British episode of financial folly obscures a broader continental pattern, one where similar conditions in two neighbouring countries, largely independent of each other, produced strikingly parallel collapses within the same narrow window of time. Newton, who understood the mathematics of orbiting bodies better than almost anyone alive, reportedly said he could calculate the motion of the heavens but not the madness of people, shortly after the South Sea Company took his money. Paper currency circulated widely in China's Song dynasty under the name Jiaozi as early as the 11th century, roughly 600 years before paper money became a common feature of European economic life. The popular assumption, understandable given how much financial vocabulary and history taught in Western schools centre on European institutions, is that paper currency is a European innovation later exported elsewhere. The actual chronology runs firmly in the opposite direction. Jiao Dizu originated in Sichuan province among merchants seeking an alternative to the heavy iron coinage the region relied on, since carrying enough iron coins to complete a substantial transaction could require an impractically heavy load. Merchants began issuing paper receipts, redeemable for deposited coin, that functioned as a lighter, more portable substitute for the metal itself, a private innovation the Song government eventually recognized, regulated, and took over as an official state currency by the early 12th century. Later Chinese dynasties, including the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, continued and expanded paper currency issuance, and it was this Yuan dynasty paper money that Venetian traveller Marco Polo famously described to a skeptical European audience upon his return in the late 13th century, presenting it as one of the more remarkable and difficult-to-believe features of the eastern lands he had visited. Europe's own experiments with paper currency did not arrive in earnest until considerably later, with formal government-backed paper notes emerging in Sweden in the 1660s and expanding gradually across other European states over the following century, often accompanied by dramatic failures, including the collapse tied to John Law's paper currency scheme in France in 1720. That made European authorities cautious about the instrument for generations, even as Chinese dynasties had already been managing, adjusting, and periodically overissuing paper currency for centuries. The idea that paper could stand in for metal and still be trusted as money did not begin in a European counting house. It began in a Chinese merchant's decision that hauling iron coins across Sichuan was simply too heavy to bother with. John Ilwes, an English Member of Parliament who died in 1789, leaving a fortune historians estimate at roughly £500,000, an enormous sum for the era, was documented by contemporaries living in conditions of deliberate, almost theatrical deprivation, despite his substantial inherited and accumulated wealth. Accounts from people who knew him describe a man who wore threadbare clothes until they disintegrated, refused to light fires even in cold weather, and reportedly ate meat that had gone bad rather than purchase anything fresh, all while quietly amassing one of the largest fortunes in Georgian England through shrewd property dealing and lending. Elwes' life later became one of the documented partial inspirations for Charles Dickens' character Ebenezer Scrooge, a literary miser whose name has since become shorthand in English for reflexive stinginess. The popular reading of misers like Elwes treats their behaviour as simple, uncomplicated greed, an excessive appetite for accumulation with no deeper explanation required. Clinicians and researchers who study hoarding behaviour in a more general context, including hoarding of money specifically, describe something psychologically closer to persistent unresolved anxiety than to appetite. The behaviour functions less like wanting more and more like a compulsive fear of having too little, a fear that objective financial security does nothing to quiet, because the anxiety was never actually calibrated to the real risk in the first place. Elwes had inherited a fortune from an uncle himself, famous for similar frugal habits, suggesting the pattern may have had a family and environmental history worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as simple character. Biographers note he was capable of real generosity in specific circumstances, including reportedly forgiving debts owed to him by struggling tenants, complicating any simple portrait of pure miserliness. The wealthiest man in a room, by Elwes' own documented example, is not always the person who feels the least afraid of losing everything. He died surrounded by money he had spent a lifetime declining to spend. The stock market crash of October 1929, when the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost roughly a quarter of its value across a matter of days, remains the single most famous date in American economic history, taught in classrooms as the moment that triggered the Great Depression. The actual documented economic record, studied extensively by economic historians over the following century, shows a considerably slower and more complicated unravelling than a single October event can account for. The American banking system, in the years following the crash, suffered a series of escalating failures, with thousands of individual banks closing between 1930 and 1933 as depositors, worried about a bank's solvency, rushed to withdraw funds in patterns that could turn a struggling bank's rumoured weakness into an actual self-fulfilling collapse. Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, in their influential later study of American monetary history, argued the Federal Reserve's failure to expand the money supply and act as a lender of last resort during these banking failures, turned a serious but survivable market correction into a prolonged national catastrophe, a policy failure occurring gradually across years rather than in the single dramatic week the crash is remembered for. International factors compounded the damage further, including the Esmut-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, which raised duties on a wide range of imported goods and is widely believed by economic historians to have provoked retaliatory tariffs abroad, shrinking international trade at precisely the moment struggling economies needed it most. Unemployment in the United States did not reach its documented peak of roughly 25% until 1933, nearly 4 years after the crash itself, a gap that alone suggests a slower unfolding process rather than a single triggering event. The crash mattered undeniably as an early and highly visible symptom of deeper strain building within the financial system, but treating it as the sole cause compresses a genuinely multi-year unravelling, involving banking policy, international trade, and monetary decisions made by multiple governments into a single dramatic morning that historians studying the full record no longer consider an adequate explanation on its own. The crash was the visible tremor. The depression that followed was built from years of aftershocks. Most people were never taught to count. The English word salary descends directly from the Latin suhlerium, a term historically connected in Roman usage to salt, though the precise mechanics of that connection have been debated by classicists for generations. One documented and frequently cited explanation holds that Roman soldiers received an allowance specifically designated for the purchase of salt, a preservative essential for keeping food edible in an era without refrigeration, and that this allowance eventually broadened in usage to describe a soldier's or official's regular payment more generally. Whatever the precise original mechanics, the underlying connection between salt and structured payment reflects salt's genuinely extraordinary value across the ancient Mediterranean world, where it functioned as one of the most important preservation technologies available to any society lacking refrigeration. Salt allowed meat and fish to be stored for months rather than days, a capability with obvious military value for provisioning armies on long campaigns far from fresh supply lines, and obvious civilian value for any household or city trying to survive a difficult winter or a poor harvest. Roman roads, including sections of the famous Via Salaria, were named for salt trade routes running from coastal salt works into the interior, underscoring how thoroughly the substance was woven into the empire's logistics and commerce. Salt taxes and salt monopolies, controlled directly by various governments across later history, from Rome through medieval and early modern Europe to imperial China, became significant and sometimes deeply resented sources of state revenue, precisely because the substance was so difficult for ordinary people to do without. The word salary, carried forward through Old French and into English, kept a linguistic fossil of this history embedded inside it long after most English speakers using the word had any reason to think about salt at all. Every payday, without anyone particularly noticing, carries a faint echo of Roman soldiers being paid in something that once mattered as much as the coin itself. A word for a modern paycheck still quietly remembers a substance most households today barely think twice about. Along extensive stretches of the East African, South Asian, and Pacific coastlines, small cowrie shells gathered primarily from the Maldive Islands circulated as a recognized and functioning currency for well over 1,000 years, used in trade, taxation, and even ceremonial payments across a remarkably wide geographic range that historians have traced through archaeological finds and written trade records alike. In parts of Mesoamerica, the Aztec Empire and neighboring cultures used cacao beans, the raw ingredient of chocolate, as a form of currency alongside cotton cloth, both goods carrying enough consistent, recognized value across the region to function reliably as money in everyday transactions. The common assumption that money has always fundamentally meant precious metal, with other forms treated as primitive substitutes awaiting the eventual arrival of gold and silver coinage, does not hold up against the documented breadth and durability of these alternative systems. Cowrie shell currency remained in active, widespread use in parts of West Africa well into the 19th century, persisting alongside and sometimes outcompeting European coinage introduced by colonial trading powers, precisely because cowries were already deeply embedded in existing trust networks and pricing conventions the metal coins had to compete against, rather than simply replace. What made any of these substances function successfully as money was never really about their intrinsic material properties in isolation. Cowrie shells are decorative, but not especially useful on their own. Cacao beans are edible, but perishable in ways metal coins are not. What mattered in every documented case was that a wide enough community agreed, consistently and predictably, on how much of the substance represented how much value, and continued honouring that agreement across enough transactions to make the substance reliable. Gold and silver eventually dominated global trade, partly because of genuine practical advantages, durability chief among them, but they were never the only substances history has trusted enough to call money. A shell gathered from a shallow tropical reef once moved goods across 3 continents as reliably as any coin ever has. In 1753, the British Parliament authorised a state lottery specifically to raise funds for a new national institution intended to house a substantial private collection of books, manuscripts, and natural specimens recently bequeathed to the nation. The lottery succeeded in raising the necessary funds, and the institution it helped finance opened its doors 3 years later as the British Museum, an establishment that remains to this day one of the most visited cultural institutions in the world. Modern conversations about lotteries often frame them as a distinctly contemporary phenomenon, sometimes criticised as a comparatively recent invention exploiting people's hopes for a shortcut to wealth. The historical record shows lotteries functioning as established, government-sanctioned tools of public finance for centuries before the British Museum's founding. Renaissance Italian city-states ran public lotteries to fund civic projects as early as the 15th century. English lotteries in the 17th century helped finance the settlement of early American colonies, including funding directed toward the Jamestown settlement in Virginia, making a lottery drawing in London part of the financial machinery behind one of the earliest permanent English colonies in North America. What has changed considerably over the centuries is less the basic mechanism than the social status attached to it. Early lotteries were frequently framed publicly as patriotic civic contributions, participation cast as a form of public-spirited investment in institutions the whole of society would benefit from, rather than as a private wager on personal fortune. That framing shifted gradually over succeeding centuries, as lotteries moved from occasional large-scale, civic fundraising events toward the frequent privately marketed drawings more familiar today, a shift in presentation and marketing far more than a shift in the underlying financial mechanism itself. The gap between an 18th century lottery ticket funding a national museum and a modern lottery ticket bought at a convenience store counter is mostly a difference in packaging and framing, not in the fundamental idea being sold. A drawing in London once helped stock the shelves of one of the world's great museums, ticket by ticket, centuries before anyone thought to call the practice old-fashioned. Horatio Alger's novels, published prolifically in the second half of the 19th century, told variations on a single beloved story. A poor boy, through hard work, honesty, and a fortunate encounter or two, rises dramatically into comfortable prosperity. The novels sold in enormous numbers and helped cement rags to riches as one of the most durable narrative templates in American culture, repeated for generations in popular retellings of successful lives, even when the actual documented details of those lives told a more complicated story. Economists and sociologists studying documented intergenerational economic mobility, the actual rate at which people born into poverty rise substantially above their starting circumstances within their own lifetime, have consistently found the dramatic version of the rags to riches trajectory considerably rarer than its cultural prominence would suggest. Large-scale mobility studies, tracking real income data across generations in multiple countries, generally find most people remain relatively close to the economic position they were born into, with genuinely dramatic upward leaps from significant poverty to substantial wealth within a single lifetime, occurring for only a small minority of the population studied, even in economies specifically celebrated for offering high mobility. Alger's own biography, ironically, complicates the myth his novels helped build. Historical accounts of his life describe a comfortable, educated background considerably more privileged than the impoverished protagonists he became famous for writing about, a gap between an author's own circumstances and the fantasy of upward mobility he spent a career selling to eager readers. None of this argues that individual dramatic rises never happen, since documented cases certainly exist and make for genuinely compelling history when they do. It argues only that the story's cultural prominence, repeated so constantly it can feel like the ordinary expectation exception, has always outpaced how frequently the actual pattern occurs in documented economic reality. The story sold millions of copies precisely because it described something rare enough to feel worth reading about. By the middle of the 16th century, the Fugger family of Augsburg had built one of the largest banking fortunes in Europe, financing Habsburg emperors, funding wars, and controlling significant mining interests across Central Europe under the leadership of Jacob Fugger, sometimes called Jakob the Rich, by contemporaries who considered the description entirely literal. The Fugger Bank's scale and political reach rivaled, and in some respects exceeded, that of the earlier Medici Bank in Florence. The Fugger family's fortunes were closely tied to loans extended to the Spanish crown, which controlled the enormous silver wealth flowing from its American territories and seemed on paper an extraordinarily reliable borrower for exactly that reason. When the Spanish crown defaulted on its debts in 1557, one among several documented Spanish defaults during this period, the Fugger Bank absorbed severe, well-documented losses, a financial blow from which the family's banking operations never fully recovered to their previous scale. Subsequent generations of the family shifted increasingly away from banking and toward landholding and aristocratic status, a documented retreat from the exposed high-risk world of sovereign lending that had built the family's original fortune but had also proven capable of inflicting catastrophic losses when a borrowing crown simply declined to pay. The Fugger case offers a useful historical corrective to the assumption that Europe's largest and most sophisticated banking houses of any given era were somehow insulated from the kind of financial ruin that could destroy smaller, less connected lenders. Sovereign default has repeatedly proven capable of damaging even the most well-established creditors throughout financial history, a pattern that recurs across centuries regardless of how large or politically connected the lender happens to be. Jacobi Fugger's name still marks streets and buildings across Augsburg today, a lingering trace of a fortune that a single defaulting crown had already begun quietly dismantling centuries before those streets were named after him. Even Europe's most trusted banking house learned that a king's signature on a loan was never quite the same as a king's silver in hand. In 1696, Isaac Newton accepted an appointment as Warden of the Royal Mint in England, a position that placed him directly in charge of pursuing counterfeiters and coin clippers, criminals who shaved small slivers of precious metal from the edges of circulating coins, gradually accumulating valuable metal shavings while leaving the coins themselves lighter, but still nominally worth their original face value. The practice had become widespread enough by the late 17th century that a substantial share of English coinage in circulation had been measurably reduced below its intended weight, undermining public confidence in the currency and complicating everyday trade. Newton, applying the same rigorous methodical approach that had produced his scientific breakthroughs, pursued the role with unusual seriousness for what many of his contemporaries considered a largely administrative sinecure. He personally interrogated suspects, studied minting techniques in forensic detail, and pushed for and helped oversee the Great Recoinage of 1696, a massive effort to withdraw England's clipped and debased silver coinage from circulation and replace it with newly minted coins featuring milled edges, a design innovation specifically intended to make future clipping visually obvious and therefore far less practical to attempt undetected. Newton's efforts as warden and later master of the mint reportedly led to numerous convictions, including at least one documented case resulting in an execution, a sentence coin clipping and counterfeiting, carried as capital crimes under English law at the time, reflecting how seriously the state treated threats to the integrity of its currency. The milled edge design Newton helped implement proved so effective at deterring clipping that variations of it remain a standard security feature on coins minted around the world today. Counterfeiting and coin debasement, far from being a distinctly modern financial crime enabled by digital technology, occupied one of the finest scientific minds in European history for a substantial portion of his later career, centuries before anyone had conceived of a counterfeit banknote. The grooved edge on a coin in anyone's pocket today still carries a faint trace of Newton's centuries-old solution to a very old crime. Roman coinage in the early imperial period, particularly the silver danaer ius, maintained a silver content close to 95% under emperors of the 1st century. Over the following 2 centuries, that silver content declined steadily and deliberately, dropping to a small single-digit percentage by the mid-3rd century, a debasement historians can trace with considerable precision through metallurgical analysis of surviving coins pulled from archaeological hoards. This decline did not occur because Roman officials were simply spending recklessly in the way modern popular usage of the word inflation sometimes implies. It occurred because successive emperors facing escalating costs for military campaigns, imperial administration, and public spectacle deliberately reduced the precious metal content of each coin while continuing to mint coins at the same nominal face value, effectively stretching a fixed supply of silver across a growing number of coins in circulation. This specific mechanism, debasement of a coin's actual metal content rather than simple overspending in the abstract, produced the price increases that Roman-era writers and later historians documented across the 3rd century, a period of genuine and severe monetary instability within the empire. The Emperor Diocletian, ruling at the end of the 3rd century, attempted a dramatic direct intervention with his edict on maximum prices in the year 301, an ambitious and ultimately unsuccessful effort to legally cap the prices of goods and services across the empire by decree, following decades of debasement-driven price increases that had badly destabilized commerce. The edict's documented failure, with goods reportedly disappearing from markets rather than being sold at the mandated low prices, illustrated that debasement's underlying economic damage could not simply be legislated away once the actual metal content of the currency had already been eroded for generations. Understanding Roman inflation as debasement rather than simple overspending matters, because it locates the failure specifically in the currency's own physical integrity, a distinct and more precise mechanism than the loose modern shorthand of a government simply spending beyond its means. The coins kept their faces, only the silver left. Historians and biographers researching wealthy historical figures naturally gravitate towards subjects whose lives left behind rich documentation, extensive correspondence, detailed business records, and public recognition during their own lifetimes, precisely the kind of documentation that successful ventures tend to generate far more reliably than failed ones. This creates a quiet, largely invisible distortion researchers call survivorship bias, in which the fortunes and figures history studies in greatest depth are disproportionately drawn from history's rarer successes, while the far more numerous failures that occurred under broadly similar conditions leave comparatively little trace for anyone to study centuries later. Consider how many merchants, speculators, and entrepreneurs across any given historical period pursued strategies remarkably similar to a documented, celebrated success story, using comparable methods, taking comparable risks, and operating in comparable markets, only to fail quietly and leave behind little more than a bankruptcy record or no record at all. Those failures rarely generate the kind of detailed personal archive, admiring biography, or institutional memory that a celebrated success naturally accumulates around itself, which means later observers studying the historical record encounter overwhelmingly more detail about the rare person who succeeded than about the far more numerous people who attempted something similar and did not. This distortion has a specific documented consequence for how people interpret the lessons a successful historical fortune seems to teach. A strategy that worked for one well-documented merchant or investor can appear, in retrospect, when the historical reality may be that dozens or hundreds of others pursued an essentially identical strategy under similar conditions and simply failed without leaving enough of a record for anyone to notice or study their attempt. None of this diminishes the genuine skill, timing, or effort behind documented historical successes. It simply means the historical record itself, by its very nature, systematically overrepresents the outcomes worth remembering and underrepresents the far more common outcomes that were not. The fortunes history chose to remember were never a representative sample of what people actually tried. A gambler at a dice table who narrowly misses a winning combination experiences something psychologists have documented as functionally distinct from an ordinary loss, a phenomenon researchers call the near-miss effect, a result that comes close to winning, even though it is, by any strict definition, exactly as much a loss as a result that misses badly, tends to activate reward-related brain responses more similar to an actual win than to a clear loss, encouraging the gambler to continue playing in a way a decisive, unambiguous loss typically does not produce to the same degree. Researchers studying financial risk, taking in more conventional economic settings, have documented closely related psychological patterns operating well outside any literal gambling context. People evaluating a financial decision that came close to a favorable outcome, even when the actual result was a loss, often describe the experience and remember it in terms strikingly similar to how gamblers describe a near miss, and this near success framing has been shown to influence how readily people take on a similar risk again, independent of whether the underlying odds of success have changed at all between attempts. Loss aversion, a broader and extensively documented psychological pattern in which people weigh the pain of a potential loss more heavily than the pleasure of an equivalent potential gain, appears consistently across both settings as well, shaping decisions at a dice table and decisions in far more mundane financial contexts through remarkably similar underlying mental mechanics, regardless of how differently society tends to regard the two activities. None of this argues that a dice table and an ordinary financial decision carry identical risks or serve identical social functions, since the structures, stakes, and social framing surrounding each differ considerably. It argues only that the same evolved mental shortcuts, built long before either casinos or financial markets existed, continue operating underneath both activities in ways the sharp social line drawn between them does not fully reflect. The mind reading a near miss at a card table and the mind reading a close call in an ordinary decision are running remarkably similar arithmetic underneath. Roman financial specialists known as Argentarii operated documented deposit, lending, and currency exchange businesses in forums across the Roman world, with records and inscriptions describing their activities, surviving from as early as the Roman Republic and continuing through the imperial period. A related class of financial specialists, the mensarii, sometimes appointed directly by the state during periods of financial crisis, extended credit and managed currency-related interventions intended to ease broader economic distress across the population. Surviving Roman legal texts, including sections of Roman civil law dealing specifically with deposit and lending disputes, describe detailed rules governing how argentarii were expected to conduct their business, including specific liability provisions covering what happened if a banker's own negligence led to a client's financial loss, rules detailed enough to suggest a genuinely mature and well-established financial practice rather than an improvised or occasional service. Roman bankers accepted deposits, extended loans at interest despite ongoing philosophical debate within Roman society about the ethics of lending, facilitated currency exchange for merchants and travellers moving across the empire's many regional coinages, and in some documented cases functioned as an early form of check clearing system, allowing merchants to settle debts through transferable credit instruments rather than always requiring physical coin to change hands. Wall paintings and inscriptions recovered from Pompeii, preserved by the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79, include depictions and records of banking activity within the city's forum, offering an unusually well-preserved snapshot of ordinary Roman financial life, exactly as it was functioning on an ordinary day before the eruption interrupted it. The assumption that organized banking is a medieval Italian innovation, often traced to Florentine and Venetian banking houses centuries later, ignores a fully functioning, legally regulated Roman financial system that had already been operating for centuries by the time those later Italian institutions were founded. The Forum's financial quarter, on any ordinary Roman morning, would have looked considerably more familiar to a modern visitor than most people assume. In 1571, the English Parliament passed a Sumptuary Act specifically regulating who was legally permitted to wear silk-knitted caps, one entry, in a much longer documented tradition of English and continental European sumptuary legislation that governed everything from the colour and fabric of clothing to the length of shoe toes and the number of courses permitted at a meal, all tied precisely to a person's rank and social standing. These laws are frequently assumed by modern audiences to reflect primarily religious concerns about modesty or restraint, but the documented legislative language and enforcement patterns tell a considerably different story. Sumptuary laws across medieval and early modern Europe were explicitly structured around social rank, rather than modesty in any general moral sense, permitting the nobility to wear precisely the fabrics, colours, and furs that laws simultaneously prohibited a wealthy merchant or tradesperson from wearing, even if that merchant could easily afford the exact same materials. The entire structure of the legislation only makes sense as an attempt to preserve visible, at a glance, class distinction in a period when a newly wealthy merchant class was increasingly able to afford clothing indistinguishable from the aristocracies, a development that deeply unsettled a social order built on being able to identify someone's rank from across a room simply by looking at what they were wearing. Enforcement records show fines and occasional public shaming, applied specifically to commoners caught wearing restricted fabrics or colours above their station, while wealthy nobility faced no equivalent restriction on their own far more extravagant dress, a pattern that would make little sense if the underlying concern were genuinely about restraining excess or promoting modest, humble clothing across society broadly rather than protecting a specific visible hierarchy. The 1571 English silk cap statute, like most sumptuary legislation across the period, was ultimately a law about who was permitted to look wealthy, entirely separate from any law about who was permitted to actually be wealthy. A merchant rich enough to dress like a duke could still be legally forbidden from doing so, purely for the crime of not having been born one. Colonial Philadelphia's Quaker merchant community, which by the mid-18th century controlled a substantial share of the city's shipping and trading wealth, is well documented by historians as deliberately maintaining plain, unadorned dress and modest household furnishing, even as individual Quaker merchants accumulated fortunes comparable to the wealthiest families anywhere in the American colonies. Quaker religious doctrine explicitly discouraged outward display and ornamentation as a form of worldly vanity, treating restraint in dress and manner as a visible expression of inward spiritual discipline rather than as a simple matter of personal taste or thrift. This produced a genuinely striking historical pattern documented across colonial Philadelphia. Wealthy Quaker merchants, capable of affording the finest imported silks, elaborate carriages, and ornate furnishings that wealthy merchants in London or Boston freely displayed, instead maintained deliberately plain dress and comparatively modest homes, directing accumulated wealth instead toward business reinvestment, community institutions including schools and hospitals, and charitable giving within and beyond their religious community, activities the faith actively encouraged in place of personal display. Historians studying colonial American wealth patterns note this stands in notable contrast to wealthy merchant communities in many other colonial cities and in Europe during the same period, where visible consumption, elaborate dress, and conspicuous entertaining functioned as an expected and socially reinforced signal of a family status and success, a signal wealthy families actively cultivated rather than avoided. The Quaker merchant pattern complicates any assumption that substantial wealth reliably produces conspicuous display as a kind of natural, universal instinct. Whether wealth gets displayed or deliberately hidden away appears, in the documented Philadelphia case, to depend considerably more on the specific values and religious framework surrounding the people holding it than on any fixed human tendency running underneath wealth itself. A fortune large enough to build a hospital was, in Quaker Philadelphia, considered entirely compatible with a coat too plain to draw a second glance. The Roman Emperor Trajan, in the early 2nd century, established and expanded a documented state program known as the Alimentu, providing regular financial support to poor children across Italy, funded partly through interest on loans the state extended to landowners, a structured public welfare mechanism operating nearly 2,000 years before modern social welfare systems are often assumed to have been invented. Parallel traditions of structured, obligatory giving developed independently within other ancient cultures around the same broad historical period. Jewish law developed the concept of tzudku, an obligation of charitable giving woven directly into religious practice and law, rather than treated as an optional act of personal kindness, with specific documented guidance across Jewish legal texts concerning how much a person of means was expected to give and to whom. Islamic law, developing several centuries later, established zakat as one of the 5 foundational pillars of the faith, a mandatory charitable contribution calculated as a specific percentage of a Muslim's accumulated wealth and distributed according to detailed, documented categories of need, making charitable giving a formal religious requirement rather than a voluntary gesture left to individual conscience. Medieval Christian Europe developed its own extensive infrastructure of organized charity through almshouses, hospitals, and monastery-run relief efforts, institutions that provided food, shelter, and basic care to the poor, the sick and travelers, often funded through a combination of church resources, wealthy individual bequests, and civic contributions coordinated at a level considerably more organized than simple person-to-person generosity. Treating structured, organized charitable giving as a distinctly modern invention, arriving alongside industrial-era philanthropy and modern non-profit institutions, overlooks an extensive and well-documented history of formalized giving obligations across multiple separate ancient and medieval cultures, each independently arriving at the conclusion that a society's wealthier members owed some structured, ongoing obligation to its poorer ones. Long before any modern charitable foundation existed, several entirely separate civilizations had already written the obligation to give into their religious and civil law. Ancient Egyptian taxation, across much of the pharaonic period, was frequently assessed and collected in grain, livestock, and labor obligations known as corvée, a system requiring subjects to contribute a set amount of unpaid work, often on royal building projects, irrigation maintenance, or agricultural labor rather than in coined money, a form of currency that did not exist in Egypt for most of the period these taxation systems were operating. Egyptian scribes maintained detailed documented records of harvest yields specifically to calculate grain tax obligations accurately, with surviving papyrus records showing careful accounting of how much of a given harvest was owed to royal or temple granaries, storage facilities that functioned simultaneously as tax collection points and as a form of state-administered famine insurance, since stored grain surpluses could be redistributed during years when the Nile's flood, on which Egyptian agriculture entirely depended, failed to reach its needed level. Corvée labor obligations, requiring subjects to contribute a set number of days of unpaid physical labor annually, similarly functioned as a form of taxation collected directly in labor rather than in any medium of exchange, a system historians have documented extensively through both textual records and the physical evidence of monumental construction projects that would have required enormous coordinated labour forces to complete, labour forces largely assembled through exactly this kind of obligatory service, rather than paid employment in any modern sense. This pattern of taxation paid in goods and labour rather than coined money was not unique to Egypt, and appears across numerous ancient and medieval societies that predated widespread coinage, or that continued relying on in-kind taxation even after coinage existed elsewhere, particularly in agrarian economies where grain and labour were simply more reliably available and more directly useful to a government than scarce metal currency would have been. Long before any tax collector counted coins into a ledger, an Egyptian scribe was already carefully counting sacks of grain and days of obligated labour with exactly the same bureaucratic precision. The most widely accepted theory among historians of currency traces the dollar symbol back to an abbreviation used by traders and clerks across Spanish-American trade in the 18th century, referring to the Spanish peso, sometimes called a piece of 8 for the 8 smaller units it was divided into. A coin that circulated so widely across the Americas, and beyond that it functioned as something close to an international trade currency, well before the United States minted its own coinage. Surviving handwritten trade ledgers and letters from the period show clerks abbreviating peso as a capital letter P, with a small superscript S, a common shorthand convention of the era for pluralizing an abbreviation, and this handwritten combination, written quickly and repeatedly across countless documents, appears to have gradually merged in casual handwriting into a single simplified mark resembling the familiar symbol used today, with the vertical stroke and curling line eventually becoming difficult to distinguish as two separate original letters once the shorthand had been copied and simplified enough times by enough different clerks. Alternative theories have circulated over the years, including a colourful but unsupported claim connecting the symbol's origin to the Pillars of Hercules, featured on Spanish coinage, and another suggesting it derives from a monogram of the letters U and S overlapping. Currency historians who have traced the documented handwriting evidence back through surviving colonial-era trade records generally regard the peso abbreviation theory as considerably better supported, since it can be traced through an actual, dated sequence of handwritten examples showing the gradual simplification happening in real historical documents, rather than resting on symbolic interpretation alone. The newly formed United States, adopting the dollar as its own currency name and eventually its own currency symbol in the late 18th century, was borrowing directly from a Spanish coin that had already been functioning as the practical trade currency across much of North America for generations, long before an American mint ever struck its own coinage, a mark scrawled quickly by trade clerks writing out Spanish coin abbreviations. Over and over across thousands of ledger pages, eventually became one of the most recognized symbols in the world. Documented court records and first-hand accounts from the so-called Golden Age of piracy, spanning roughly the late 17th through early 18th centuries, describe pirate crews overwhelmingly spending their plunder quickly, often within weeks of a successful raid, on drink, gambling, provisions and payment owed to crew members under the documented share systems most pirate ships operated by. Port towns like Nassau in the Bahamas, which functioned during this period as a well-documented haven for pirate crews between voyages, thrived economically precisely because pirates arriving with fresh plunder tended to spend it rapidly and visibly, rather than hoarding or hiding it away for later. Against this well-documented pattern of quick spending stands one of the very few genuinely verified cases of buried pirate treasure, associated with Captain William Kidd, an English privateer turned accused pirate whose captured ship's cargo, including gold and jewels, he reportedly buried on Gardiner's Island off the coast of Long Island in 1699 before sailing onward to face capture and eventual trial in England. Investigators later recovered a portion of Kidd's buried cash, using it as evidence in his subsequent trial, making this one of the only documented instances in the entire historical record of the buried treasure trope actually occurring roughly as popular legend imagines it. The enduring cultural image of pirates routinely burying treasure across secluded islands, marked with cryptic maps for later recovery, appears to derive disproportionately from this single well-publicized Kidd case, later amplified enormously by 19th century adventure fiction, particularly Robert Allowo's Steve Unson's novel Treasure Island, which cemented buried treasure as an expected and essentially universal feature of pirate life in the popular imagination, despite the actual historical record showing it was closer to a rare exception than a common practice. Kidd's single documented burial did more to shape how the world imagines piracy than centuries of actual pirates spending their plunder loudly and quickly in port ever did. Most pirates, given the choice history actually shows they made, preferred spending their fortune to burying it. Marcus Porcius Cato, known to history as Cato the Elder, built a public reputation across the 2nd century before the Common Era as a fierce advocate for traditional Roman frugality, reportedly criticizing extravagant spending among fellow senators, personally overseeing his own agricultural estates with hands-on discipline, and writing a surviving treatise on farming that emphasizes careful, unglamorous use in its own right, not nas, a practical necessity, not merely a practical necessity. At almost precisely the same period, Lucius Licinius Lucullus, a Roman general and politician who amassed enormous wealth through military campaigns in the Eastern Mediterranean, became so famous within Rome for lavish, extravagant banquets that his name eventually entered the language as an adjective, Lucullan, describing spreads of extraordinary luxury and abundance, a reputation contemporaries recorded with a mixture of admiration and disapproval, depending on their own views, about how a wealthy Roman ought to conduct himself. The documented contrast between Cato's public asceticism and Lucullus' public extravagance, both prominent, wealthy, politically significant Romans operating within the same narrow historical window, illustrates how far from unified Roman elite culture actually was on the question of how wealth ought to be displayed or restrained. Roman moral and political writing from the period is full of debate on exactly this tension, with philosophers and politicians arguing on both sides about whether visible luxury corrupted public virtue or whether a certain degree of display was simply appropriate to a man's earned station. Modern assumptions sometimes flatten ancient elite culture into a single uniform attitude toward wealth, whether imagining it as universally austere or universally decadent. The genuinely documented record, sitting Cato and Lucullus side by side within the very same Roman generation, shows neither assumption holds up particularly well on its own. Rome, in the very same decades, produced both a senator, famous for eating simply, and a general famous for banquets that gave the language a whole new word for excess. Philip II of Spain, ruling from 1556 to 1598 over an empire that included territories across Europe and the enormous silver-producing colonies of the Americas, presided over a crown that defaulted on its debts 4 separate times during his reign, in 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, despite commanding wealth that made his empire the envy of every other European power of the era. The consistent underlying pressure behind each of these defaults, as documented in Spanish Crown financial records that historians have studied extensively, was sustained, overlapping military spending across multiple simultaneous fronts, including prolonged conflict in the Netherlands, wars against the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean, and the enormously costly and ultimately unsuccessful Spanish Armada campaign against England in 1588. Each of these campaigns required financing on a scale that, even with the extraordinary influx of American silver arriving regularly through the treasure fleets, consistently outpaced what the Crown could actually raise through taxation and silver revenue combined, forcing Spain to borrow heavily against future silver shipments from banking houses across Europe, including the Fugger family of Augsburg, who suffered severely when Spain periodically declined to honour those obligations. The popular assumption that successful military campaigns and territory expansion reliably translate into a wealthier, more financially secure state runs directly against Spain's documented 16th century experience. Military success and expanded territory did bring Spain enormous prestige and genuine resource wealth, but the cost of financing continuous warfare across multiple fronts simultaneously consistently exceeded what even an empire flush with American silver could sustainably afford, a mismatch that produced repeated sovereign default rather than the growing treasury a purely resource-focused view of empire might predict. Spain's 16th century experience stands as one of history's most thoroughly documented illustrations that an empire's income and an empire's solvency are not remotely the same measurement. An empire that mined more silver than any state in the world had ever mined before still could not outrun the cost of the wars it kept choosing to fight. Loss aversion, a psychological pattern first formally documented in the influential research of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in the late 1970s, describes a consistent human tendency to experience the pain of losing something as considerably more intense than the pleasure of gaining an equivalent amount. Asymmetry researchers have measured repeatedly across a wide range of experimental settings and, notably, across participants spanning a broad range of income and wealth levels rather than concentrated among any single economic group. This matters directly against a common, mostly unexamined assumption that anxious, loss-focused thinking about money is primarily a feature of financial hardship, something people with fewer resources experience more acutely, simply because they have less cushion against a potential loss. Documented behavioral research instead shows wealthy individuals exhibiting comparably strong loss aversion in controlled experimental settings, sometimes displaying even more pronounced loss-averse behavior in decisions involving their accumulated wealth than lower-income participants. Show in decisions involving comparatively smaller absolute sums, a finding that runs counter to any simple assumption that having more cushion automatically produces calmer, less anxious financial decision-making. Historical accounts of wealthy individuals across many different eras document behavior consistent with this research, describing prosperous merchants, bankers, and landowners exhibiting persistent, sometimes disproportionate anxiety about specific losses, even while holding overall wealth that, by any objective external measure, left them thoroughly secure. The anxiety these documented figures displayed rarely appears calibrated to their actual objective risk of hardship, suggesting the underlying psychological mechanism operates largely independent of a person's real financial safety margin. None of this suggests financial hardship carries no genuine, distinct additional pressures of its own. Since scarcity clearly does impose real and specific burdens, research has documented separately. It simply means the particular mental habit of weighing potential losses more heavily than equivalent gains is not a poverty-specific trait, but a broadly shared feature of how most human minds, regardless of what they actually hold, tend to evaluate risk. The fear of losing what one has, it turns out, does not shrink reliably just because what one has keeps growing. Barbara Hutton, born in 1912, as heiress to a substantial portion of the F.W. Woolworth retail fortune, inherited a sum historians estimate at roughly the equivalent of several $100 million in today's money upon reaching adulthood, making her one of the wealthiest women in the world at the time, and earning her the enduring, somewhat unkind press nicknamed the poor little rich girl. Hutton's subsequent life is extensively documented in contemporary press coverage and later biographies, describing 7 marriages across her lifetime, several of them to titled European aristocrats, whose own family fortunes had significantly declined, unions that involved substantial documented payments and settlements flowing from Hutton's inheritance toward her new husbands and their families as a condition of the marriages themselves, combined with extensive personal spending on real estate, jewelry, and an extravagant lifestyle maintained across multiple countries. Hutton's fortune, once among the largest inherited by any woman in American history, had been very substantially depleted by the time of her death in 1979, with reports at the time describing her estate as a small fraction of what she had originally inherited decades earlier. Hutton's case is frequently cited by researchers and financial historians, studying inherited wealth as an illustration that a large inheritance, absent structures, or personal habits oriented toward preservation does not automatically sustain itself across a lifetime, let alone across generations. The pattern echoes findings from broader, more systematic studies of family wealth across generations, which consistently find that the presence of a large initial sum says comparatively little on its own about whether that sum will still exist decades later, a pattern that depends considerably more on how the wealth is managed, spent, and structured than on its original size. Hutton's story, told and retold across decades of press coverage often more interested in her personal life than in the financial mechanics behind her declining fortune, nonetheless offers one of the most thoroughly documented cautionary examples of how quickly even an extraordinarily large inheritance can be spent down within a single lifetime. An inheritance, however enormous at the moment it arrives, is only ever a starting balance, not a guarantee of where the balance ends. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1602, is widely recognized by financial historians as the world's first formal stock exchange, created specifically to facilitate trading of shares in the Dutch East India Company, a trading enterprise that had itself pioneered the modern joint stock corporation structure, allowing large numbers of investors to pool capital and share in the company's profits and risks through tradable shares, rather than requiring any single wealthy backer to fund an entire costly overseas trading voyage alone. The Amsterdam Exchange developed, within decades of its founding, a documented set of trading practices that would remain recognizable to anyone familiar with later stock markets, including active buying and selling of shares among investors who had no direct involvement in the company's actual operations, speculative trading practices including early forms of short selling that Dutch authorities periodically attempted, largely unsuccessfully, to restrict and organized printed price information circulated regularly among traders and the broader merchant community, an early forerunner of the price reporting systems later exchanges would formalize. The New York Stock Exchange, whose own founding is conventionally dated to an agreement signed by a group of brokers in 1792, and the London Stock Exchange, formally organised in 1801 though informal trading in London coffee houses, predates that date considerably. Both emerged well over a century after Amsterdam's exchange had already been operating, developing many of its own foundational practices from trading patterns that had first been worked out on the Amsterdam Exchange. Decades earlier, the common association of organised stock trading primarily with New York or London, reinforced by the outsized global prominence those two exchanges eventually achieved during the 19th and 20th centuries, obscures how much of the basic mechanics of exchange-based trading, the tradable share, the active secondary market, the organised price reporting, had already been worked out on a canal side exchange floor in Amsterdam roughly 2 centuries earlier. Long before any broker gathered under a buttonwood tree in Lower Manhattan, traders on an Amsterdam exchange floor were already buying and selling shares in a company most of them would never personally see a ship from. In October 1907, the failure of the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York, following revelations of risky speculative lending tied to a failed attempt to corner the market in copper mining stock, triggered a rapid, well-documented wave of withdrawals from other trust companies and banks across the city, as depositors, alarmed by the Knickerbocker's collapse, rushed to withdraw their own funds before their own bank potentially suffered a similar fate. Economists studying bank runs, both this specific 1907 episode and the broader pattern across financial history, have generally moved away from describing the behaviour as simple, irrational mass hysteria, and instead describe it as a coherent, if collectively damaging, response to a genuine and reasonable underlying uncertainty. A depositor in 1907, lacking the kind of detailed, real-time information about a bank's actual solvency that modern regulatory disclosure and deposit insurance later provided, faced a real and rational dilemma. If enough other depositors withdrew their funds first, even a fundamentally sound bank could be forced into failure simply from a shortage of available cash on hand, regardless of how healthy the bank's actual underlying loan portfolio was. Given that risk withdrawing early was, from any individual depositor's perspective, often the single most rational available response to uncertain information, even though the same behaviour, multiplied across thousands of individual depositors making the same reasonable calculation simultaneously, could turn a rumour into the very collapse everyone was individually trying to avoid. The 1907 panic was eventually contained through a documented ad hoc intervention led by financier J.P. Morgan, who personally organised a coalition of other bank leaders to pledge emergency funds shoring up affected institutions, an intervention historians widely credit with helping directly inspire the creation of the Federal Reserve System several years later, specifically intended to provide exactly the kind of institutional lender of last resort function Morgan had improvised personally in 1907. Understanding bank runs as a rational, if collectively destructive, response to genuine uncertainty rather than as simple mob panic changes how the episode reads. It was not a crowd losing its senses. It was a great many individually reasonable people, all reaching the same reasonable conclusion at exactly the same unfortunate moment. Morgan's personal intervention held the crisis to realise it needed a permanent version of exactly what he had improvised. Andrew Carnegie, having built one of the largest personal fortunes in American history through his steel industry holdings, published an essay in 1889 commonly known today as The Gospel of Wealth. A document historians and biographers have studied extensively both for its influence on later American philanthropy and for what it reveals about Carnegie's own documented private anxieties surrounding the fortune he had accumulated. The essay argues, in Carnegie's own words, that a wealthy person holds accumulated riches essentially in trust for the broader community, and that failing to distribute that wealth constructively during one's own lifetime, rather than simply passing it down through inheritance, represents a kind of moral failure. Carnegie wrote with particular concern about the corrupting effect he believed large inherited fortunes had on the character of the children who received them, a documented preoccupation that led him, in practice, to give away the overwhelming majority of his own fortune to libraries, universities, and other institutions before his death in 1919, rather than leaving the bulk of it to his own descendants. Biographers examining Carnegie's extensive personal correspondence describe a man who, despite having achieved a level of financial security most of his contemporaries could barely imagine, remained documented across decades as genuinely preoccupied with questions of what his wealth meant, what obligations it created, and whether accumulating it as aggressively as he had was ultimately compatible with the kind of life and legacy he wanted to be remembered for. This documented anxiety, emerging from one of the wealthiest men who ever lived rather than from someone facing any genuine material insecurity, complicates any simple assumption that financial worry is something that recedes automatically once a fortune grows large enough. Carnegie's own writing suggests the opposite was closer to true in his specific documented case, that the scale of his wealth intensified rather than resolved his preoccupation with what having it actually meant. The richest man of his era spent a considerable portion of his later writing trying to work out what his own fortune had actually cost him. Temples across ancient Greece, including prominent sanctuaries such as the Temple of Apollo at Delphi and the Temple of Hera on the island of Samos, minted and issued their own coinage, independently of any central governing authority, a practice well documented through archaeological finds and inscriptions across the Greek world during the archaic and classical periods, well before the idea of a single central government monopoly over currency issuance had become an established norm anywhere. Greek temples of this era functioned as significant independent economic institutions in their own right, accumulating substantial wealth through donations, dedicated offerings, and their own agricultural and commercial holdings, wealth that some temples then used to mint their own recognized coinage, stamped with symbols specific to the deity or sanctuary in question, coinage that circulated and was accepted in trade well beyond the immediate religious community that produced it, a testament to how much independent credibility a respected temple's economic reputation could carry across the wider Greek world. This pattern of fragmented, non-centralized minting authority persisted well beyond the ancient Greek world. Medieval European guilds and individual cities across the Holy Roman Empire similarly held documented minting rights, called Münzrecht in German territories, granted by local or imperial authority, but exercised with considerable independence, resulting in an often bewildering variety of regional coinages circulating simultaneously across relatively small geographic areas, each guild or city producing currency according to its own standards of weight and purity, standards that other regions had to actively evaluate and sometimes distrust when accepting a coin from outside their own immediate area. The now familiar assumption that minting currency has always been a tightly held government monopoly, an assumption reinforced by the highly centralized modern currency systems most people are familiar with today, misreads a much longer and considerably messier history in which temples, guilds, individual cities, and eventually national governments all held overlapping and often simultaneous claims to the authority of striking coin. A coin stamped with a god's symbol once carried exactly as much trust across the ancient Greek world as any coin struck by a king ever did. Clay tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamian sites and dated by archaeologists to roughly 4,000 years ago, inscribed in cuneiform script, record detailed debt and credit transactions including loans of grain, silver and livestock between individuals, temples and merchants, complete with documented terms specifying repayment amounts, timeframes and in some cases interest owed, functioning as legally binding records comparable in purpose, if not in form, to a modern loan agreement. These surviving tablets, numbering in the thousands across museum collections and archaeological archives, predate the earliest known coined money, minted in Lid E, roughly a millennium and a half later, by an enormous span of recorded history, showing that structured documented systems of credit and debt obligation were already fully developed, complete with courts and legal mechanisms for enforcing repayment or resolving disputes, long before anyone had struck the first standardized metal coin. Historians and archaeologists studying these Mesopotamian records describe a genuinely sophisticated credit economy, with temple administrators functioning in some documented respects like early institutional lenders, extending grain loans to farmers ahead of a harvest, and recording the expected repayment with interest, a practice recognizable as fundamentally similar in structure, though obviously not in scale or technology, to lending arrangements that would still be recognizable millennia later. The common modern assumption that credit, lending, and structured debt are relatively recent financial innovations developed alongside modern banking institutions badly misjudges just how far back the underlying practice actually extends. Mesopotamian society had already developed detailed legal and administrative infrastructure for managing credit obligations for well over 1,000 years before the very first coin existed anywhere in the world for anyone to lend or borrow in the first place. Credit, as a documented human practice, is considerably older than money itself, a sequence exactly backward from what most people quietly assume without ever having reason to question it. The clay tablet recording a debt outlived the harvest it financed by roughly 4,000 years, and it is still legible today. The jar of foreign coins is still on that shelf, wherever that kitchen actually was, and it will likely stay there for another generation or two before anyone finally throws it out or forgets what it was for. That is really how most of what people believe about money survives. Not through argument, not through evidence weighed and accepted, but through repetition inside a family, a neighborhood, a culture, until the belief feels less like a claim and more like the shape of the room itself. 50 of those inherited shapes have passed through this list now, a misquoted line of scripture that outlived the sentence it replaced, a quote invented for a scientist who never said it, a statistic withdrawn by the very people who first published it, still repeated at dinner tables decades later, a flower that briefly rivaled a house, and a family fortune that thinned out over 4 generations until nobody at a reunion could be found holding it anymore. None of it was offered as a lesson about what to do with anyone's own money. It was only ever an account of what people have actually done with theirs, across 5,000 years of tablets, coins, ledgers, and quiet family catastrophes, and of the stubborn, comforting stories they told themselves about it afterward. Some of these myths will keep circulating anyway, regardless of anything said here. That is what myths about money tend to do. They are rarely defeated by being corrected. They simply wait patiently for the next person who needs a simple story more than they need an accurate one. The jar stays on the shelf. Nobody in that kitchen was ever really keeping the coins. They were keeping the story the coins were there to tell,